Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is Hannum with ReposiTrak. Thanks for joining us for another in our series of webinars on FSMA 204 traceability. I'm really pleased today to have, once again with me, Ben Miller from the Acheson group, which we also call TAG. And we're going to have Ben actually follow up on some of the detailed questions that you've asked us from other webinars and actually go deeper on the required traceability plan that's in the new FSMA 204 rule. Before that, I'll just do a couple of housekeeping details here. You may submit questions for Ben to answer or me to answer during the course of the webinar in the question pane. So just submit the questions in the question pane and we'll get to all of them at the end of the webinar. After the webinar, we're going to send you a very brief survey. It's just a few questions. If you would take the time to fill out the survey, that's helping us to create the content for future webinars and other information we can provide to you and bring you resources to help you deal with the challenges presented by FSMA 204 traceability for you and your customers. And also we have the normal Traceability Tuesdays webinar. This is just an offshoot of that. So next Tuesday and for the foreseeable future, we'll always be getting together at this time to talk FSMA 204 traceability and provide you any updates that we have through our work in the supply chain. So without further ado, I will introduce Ben. So Ben is the head of the scientific and regulatory affairs at the Acheson group. And as you can see here, he's about as deep as you can get in the area of foodborne illness, food safety, outbreak investigation, including leading the state of Minnesota's animal and human food regulatory programs for a number of years, serving on FDA task force around food safety and traceability, and actually did his PhD thesis on the concepts that underpin the FSMA 204 traceability rule, critical tracking events, and key data elements. So again, Ben is the foremost expert on this, certainly outside the government. And we are, as always, very pleased and honored to have Ben join us for the webinar. So again, we're going to go into the traceability rule, particularly around developing your traceability plan. And then we're going to revisit some of the questions we've gotten on webinars and after webinars and answer those directly today, and also open it up again for Q&A for you at the end. So Ben, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your time as always.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, great to be with everyone today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, terrific. So let's just back up and go at a higher level here. Why are we talking about traceability? We know that FSMA 204 is upon us. Certainly most of the people on this call are probably on the call because they're either impacted by it or think they might be. There's a lot of terminology. Recall and traceability has been around a long time. Just help us make sense of all this. Why are we talking about traceability in the way that we are today?
Yeah, no, great question, Derek. And I think this is just working on a traceback investigation yesterday, actually. So in looking at sort of why the agency did, put this rule out here, I think there's an understanding within industry. It's like, well, I can recall a product. I'm really good at recall. I can figure out what I need to recall, and I can always be more conservative in terms of scoping a recall activity. So, if I'm good at recall, I'm going to be covered in terms of traceability. And I think that's a common understanding, and I'll hazard to call it a misperception right now. So I think, obviously the people that are on this webinar, they're the ones at the beginning of the semester that are, learning the material and are going to be well prepared when January 2026 rolls around. So thank you for being here, because, I think this is a key point of understanding, and one that, you can take forward and help differentiate within your organization as well. The traceability rule is really all about investigation. And so the reason that FDA and the Food Safety Modernization Act back in 2011 actually kind of gave, Congress granted FDA this authority, was to really speed investigation of foodborne illness outbreaks. So if we have a group of people that match by whole genome sequence that are getting sick, and they're reporting, some common exposures, let's say they all ate at the same restaurant chain, or maybe they purchased food from different grocery chains, and it's a commercially distributed food, the FDA conducts a traceback investigation, or the state does. And that's what I did for a number of years at the state of Minnesota. What information is needed is kind of the more specific lot code information in terms of who sold a particular lot code to the next person downstream in the supply chain, because that's what investigators are essentially trying to trace back. So it's really all about specificity and how we pass that lot code information forward in the supply chain, that so investigators can go back up the supply chain and find points of convergence within that distribution system or within the supply chain. That's, if you talk to a traceback investigator, we're always talking about convergence. We're looking for those supply chains to converge to a single point, if that's a manufacturing facility or a farm, you know, as far back in the supply chain as we can get, as accurately and quickly as possible to identify what the potential source of the outbreak was or could be. You know, and that has what I'll call sort of knock-on effects or benefits in terms of recall, in the sense that we're able to do then more targeted recalls if we know that it was lot code 1234 that was associated with the outbreak. We can then trace that forward in the supply chain and do a much more targeted recall activity. But a recall is really about the corrective action, right? So traceability is about the ability to investigate what's happening and find that point of convergence in the supply chain. So I just wanted to, you know, I think it was important to talk about sort of the why behind the rule, like why is this the case, and, you know, think about sort of why the rule is written the way that it is. And so they're related but very different concepts. So in a lot of the conversations I've been having recently, this concept of recall, and I can do recall, I can recall things quickly, and I can quickly identify what I've distributed. Then that's great, but it's identifying what you received upstream with a high level of precision that is really what the traceability rule is about. And you know, we'll dig into that in terms of CTEs and KDEs and all that here. But you know, and I think this diagram just sort of shows the complexity that's actually came as a traceback diagram, actually, of like tuna outbreak that happened back in 2013, 2014. But this is kind of what investigators would be creating in the course of an outbreak investigation back then. So, you know, 10 years ago, this was kind of the state of the art. Well, let's look at the way, you know, invoices were knit together and, you know, try to find these points of convergence within the supply chain. So you're seeing kind of those red boxes as common suppliers, or suppliers that were common to where all these restaurant association or cases occurred. So if you look at kind of that third line down, there's a common importer, and if investigators traced that back, they got back to a common fishery that, based on kind of the time frame of product distribution, started to explain those case exposures. So that takes a long time, or took a long time, especially when lot code information wasn't flowing through the supply chain all the way out to the restaurant or retail level. And so, you know, that's something that we'll, I think, touch on in some subsequent questions. But I think this visual was helpful in terms of we're going backwards in the supply chain and that trace back, and really trying to get as specific as we can to identify that point of convergence.
Yeah, and I think in our work and working with a lot of wholesalers and retailers, we know a lot of their focus is really on the recall, right? And it's like you said, that's more of the corrective action, but there's all of this very complex investigatory work that's happening in the traceback activity that the individual supply chain partners don't have visibility to and can't really appreciate just how involved and time consuming it is, and which is really, and I so appreciate you focusing on this, because is the why of FSMA 204, because everybody's focused on the what. Does it impact me, and what do I need to do? So it's the what. But plenty of people are saying, why am I dealing with this now, and why did the government take these steps at the time they did? And hopefully this gives people a better appreciation of, again, this is about trying to understand the source of an outbreak faster, right? And then as an offshoot of that, or an outcome of that, we can do a more precise recall, because we've traced those lot codes, and importantly, the lot code generator source, right, all the way through the supply chain under FSMA 204. So, you know, on the subject of recalling, and again, we talk about recalls a lot. I mean, recalls happen certainly weekly, almost daily, I would guess, these days. So isn't the industry already pretty good at recalling product? How effective is recalling today?
Yeah, I think recalls are effective, by and large, and it's because, right now we do take that cautious approach. The food industry, I think, is, rightly so, if there's an event where, I'm trying to sort of bookend my recall, I'm going to be more conservative. I'm going to cast a wider net, if you will, in terms of what gets recalled. And so, from a public health protection standpoint, from a brand protection standpoint, I think that's a good approach, and the industry has figured that out. So we are good at recalling product. We're still not good at kind of tracing product back, I would say. And so this graphic just shows that as product flows through the supply chain, there's all these points at which we're talking about critical tracking events, we're talking about key data elements, and it's by constructing that system that we're going to get to that point of sort of being better at quickly identifying where product came from, not necessarily where it went. We can be more conservative when we figure out where product went, right? But we have to be really precise when we're trying to figure out where product came from, or if we're trying to figure out where a specific lot of product came from. So, this graphic comes from GS1 and talks about kind of their case level traceability, sort of down to the point of distribution and out to restaurants and food service, and sort of the data structures that exist. So a lot of these frameworks have existed for a long time. Now, obviously, in some instances, they may require different ways of kind of capturing and storing data as part of that process. And that's really, I think, where the challenge, both in understanding and potentially implementing the rule, comes into place. And we're going to talk a little bit about some solutions to that, Derek, later in the conversation. But this is really kind of just an example of a supply chain. We're good at recall, but again, some of these data elements don't necessarily exist at the level of precision required by the rule right now to go from that operator back to the supplier level.
Yeah, that's great. So we've referenced the traceability plan a few times. This is a screenshot right from one of FDA's resources, right? And it lays out across the top the critical tracking events. Those little tabs in white are the critical tracking events, and they include the traceability plan in there. And so it looks like it's part of the requirement for anybody covered under FSMA 204. So can you just explain it, Ben, and help us understand what the requirement is and what companies should be doing or need to do as it relates to a traceability plan?
Yeah, and the FDA website is pretty good at laying out what these requirements are, and they come right from the language and the rule and the regulation itself. So I won't read them all to everyone here. You can do that and see what's on there. The two or three that I would draw your attention to, and I think this is where we're working with others in the industry or our clients to help them understand how do I sort of do these things, the description of the procedures to maintain, the description of the procedures to identify, and the description of how the traceability lot codes are actually defined. So, I think some on the call are probably fairly familiar with developing food safety plans, doing hazard analyses, defining where your preventive controls are. We're using a very similar approach with those that we're working with in this space, to think about how do I create sort of a systemized or process-based approach to identifying the procedures for records, identifying your CTEs, your KDEs. Once you've identified them, mapping that out in a process flow, or really using the process flow to identify them, I should say. And there's some complexity there once you start to really kind of put boxes on a piece of paper and figure out, okay, well, here's my inputs into let's say a transformation event. If one of those inputs changes, does that trigger a new traceability lot code as part of the transformation event, or do I keep the same traceability lot code? What does the rule say? And so sometimes that's situationally dependent based on the type of ingredient we're talking about. Is it an FDL food? Is it not? So again, what sort of feels simple on the surface sometimes gets complex when we start to really map these things out. And really at the end of the day, you want to be able to capture all of that in the traceability plan, because that's going to describe your process and the procedures from a data capture standpoint that you want to use to say, these are the CTEs that I've identified, here in my KDEs, here's how it maps into my data systems. and here's the records that I use to essentially capture and support that for the critical tracking events that I have to manage.
So it sounds like this is work that the Acheson group actually does as part of your advisory with your clients, correct?
It is, yeah. And I think then these are some of the points at a high level that we really, start to sit down and roll up our sleeves and try to work kind of side by side with people on, and a lot of people are just beginning kind of their traceability adventure, if you want to call it that, like as it relates to developing traceability plans and thinking about, I have these CTEs, I have these KDEs, are they compliant with the rule right now based on the data that I have? I mean, obviously people that are, those in the food industry have a lot of this information already, but part of it is simply mapping it to the key data element requirements in the rule. And I think understanding too, where you sit in the supply chain, you may need to do some education of your suppliers upstream or of your customers downstream, because you're reliant on them correctly identifying something as traceability lot code. So like, what is that traceability lot code and how are they applying it to their product? And is that compliant necessarily? Because if they're not doing it the right way and I'm receiving that information, I'm passing less accurate information forward in the supply chain. So part of this, the process that we use is sitting down and really mapping what that supply chain is. And you can start with, your process flow diagram if you're talking about internal traceability that you would use for your developing your food safety plan. But really oftentimes you have to start to pull apart, different steps in that process and say, okay, at a more granular level, what are the activities that are happening when I transform a product or when I receive a product? And, are there additional critical tracking events or key data elements that I need to capture there? And kind of really most critically, where am I applying that traceability lot code to? And when can I change it as well? Because, depending on the way that the product flows through the supply chain, the rule is pretty specific. There are only certain times when you can actually change or apply a new traceability lot code. So that's just, devil's in the details as it is with everything. But I think, we're at the point right now where taking a systemized approach to this, and then also, if you feel like you as an entity within the supply chain have correctly identified, your piece of the supply chain from a CTE standpoint, really working with those either upstream or downstream from you in the supply chain to make sure that they get it as well. I think that's going to be an important piece of this over the next couple of years.
Yeah, that seems to be where, for those who are familiar with creating a HACCP plan or a food safety plan, that seems to be where the traceability plan departs, right? Is that you're so dependent under FSMA 204 for the data flows between the trading partners, so inbound and outbound, that this is arguably broader in scope than a HACCP plan or a food safety plan, right? Certainly more considerations as it relates to your trading partners and your overall supply chain.
Yeah, exactly, right, because, again, everybody's you're responsible for your piece of the supply chain, but for this to sort of work well or the way it's intended under the regulation, everybody has to get their piece right, and so I think it is going to require a little more partnership and conversation. I think we're good at working with suppliers right now from a food safety standpoint to say, send me a certificate of analysis if it's part of my ingredient specification. I'm going to look at audits for you in terms of, food safety and your performance, especially if you're controlling a hazard on my behalf. But similar conversations really need to happen in this traceability space to make sure, like, okay, how are you applying that traceability lot code? And if I receive it, am I required to maintain that, as part of my portion of the supply chain?
And as part of any regulation, or certainly new regulation, people always ask about exemptions, right? So what can you tell us about exemptions as it relates to the traceability plan requirement?
Yeah, and I think, if you can unequivocally say you're never going to handle an FTL food in terms of distribution or transformation, then you don't need a traceability plan. But you're probably not on this webinar then too, maybe. But and if you do handle FTL foods and qualify for an exemption, and and there's a pretty lengthy list of exemptions that are based on your sales model and dollar amounts, and sometimes those don't even necessarily match up for which exemption we're talking about. Strictly speaking, under the regulation, the traceability plan isn't required, although I would argue it's still a good idea to demonstrate that you've gone through the exercise to demonstrate that that exemption actually applies, so that if FDA is on site and inspecting you just under its regular authority and asks about traceability, you've got some document that you can point to and say, yeah, we've gone through the exercise and we don't handle any FTL foods, or we fall under this particular exemption. That just helps from a documentation standpoint and probably gets the question answered more quickly. I think obviously supply chains are fluid, they change quickly. Somebody that might be exempt today may not be exempt tomorrow if they go over a dollar amount. And so that again is where having thought about and started to build a traceability plan, even if you're not required to today, you might be required to tomorrow. And so then you've got that document in place and can flip over and start to be compliant basically at the time frame that you're required to. And so once we get past January 20th, 2026, there's really no lead-in time for this. So if you're exempt on January 20th, not on February 20th, having that framework in place is still gonna, I think, will have been time well spent.
Yeah, and I'll just say this about exemptions generally. If you do handle food that's on the food traceability list, and you're selling to larger customers, larger meaning like wholesalers or larger retailers, don't be surprised if they don't honor your exemption. And here's why, right? Because they have hundreds, or in some cases thousands, of suppliers that are impacted by FSMA 204, and they're not equipped to handle one-off, small numbers of exemptions. They don't have the mechanisms in place to confirm your exemption on a year-to-year basis, and nor do they have the time to pursue that. So again, don't be surprised if you're a smaller supplier and you feel you're exempt, and you might actually be exempt technically under the rule that your retailer customer still requires you to be compliant with their FSMA 204 requirements as if you weren't exempt. Just don't be surprised by that, because as we work with retailers and wholesalers every day, I can tell you exemptions really aren't something that they're equipped to deal with, and frankly don't want to. So it might not make you happy, but I'm just trying to help you be prepared for it, because it's inevitable. If you have a large customer, they probably won't honor your exemption. Oh, and here's some other exemption language, right? So there definitely are exemptions, right? And they're well spelled out in the regulation. At least I believe they're well spelled out. Ben, you can maybe go a little bit deeper on this. I commented on what I think might happen practically in the supply chain, or what we know will happen practically in the supply chain in terms of who might honor an exemption. But it's probably worth talking about some of the exemptions, and because nobody's exempt from doing anything, right? There still are requirements even if you're exempt, correct?
Yeah, that there are partial exemptions. So and again, we could probably spend a 2-hour webinar. In fact, I think FDA did when they first rolled the rule out and did their webinar in the beginning of January. There's really lengthy section on the agency addressing those exemptions. So I think if people want a really in-depth look at that, they can go access that webinar. I think they spend at least an hour going through all the different exemptions. They've got full exemptions, partial exemptions. Again, from, I think, to kind of piggyback off what you were saying, Derek, is like, even if you qualify, other members in the supply chain may not recognize that exemption for your FTL food. So, and this goes back to, again, thinking about how to develop your traceability plan. So part of that plan should, at least I think it's a best practice, identify, if you change, or if an exemption no longer applies, that you've got a plan in place to start, collecting that data and sharing it when you need to. So, I think there's also the reality, and this again, it sort of speaks to what you were talking about. So, if someone isn't exempt but thinks they are and aren't sharing the necessary CTs or KDEs, they're could be regulatory or legal liability risk, right? Because, it's kind of to this point of the last bullet here, traceback investigations happen during outbreaks. And so, when FDA or states starts investigating a particular supply chain, and they find that somebody wasn't maintaining the records that they were supposed to, that's obviously a liability to that entity, but it may be a liability for other trading partners as well, because they don't have the information that they need, and if we end up in situations where people are ill because of a product, in the US, we've got strict liability law, and people, just by virtue of handling or distributing a product, there is some liability associated with that. So that's just kind of another reason to think about how you want to be strategic in your use of exemptions or not.
Yeah, we have a saying here at ReposiTrak about traceability. If traceability were free and easy, everybody would be doing it, right? And so as we move toward FSMA 204 compliance and help the industry do that and do it in a way that's very inexpensive and easy to do, what we're finding is that, and we believe this to be true across the industry, is that traceability will start to spread more naturally as the obvious benefits of having a more transparent and safer food supply chain, right, are realized. And because we all benefit from that, because we're all consumers of food, right, as well as being in the food industry for our livelihoods. So again, I'm just hoping you understand, I'm happy to have these conversations with anybody. You can request a conversation with us, happy to have a conversation. If you're a small supplier and you think you're exempt, don't be surprised if your customer doesn't treat you as exempt. And frankly, it's not that hard to be in compliant with FSMA 204, and you can do it with the help of some people who are good at it in the supply chain. It's in the best interest of your business, really, to be FSMA 204 compliant. You wouldn't want to be excluded from business for not being willing to be FSMA 204 compliant, and that's real risk too. So there's commercial consideration here for all of the companies who might actually be technically exempt, but the customers won't treat you that way. Okay, so let's go. These are some of the common questions that we've gotten over the last several months as we've been doing webinars and working with companies all up and down the supply chain, and certainly the Acheson Group's work in the supply chain. So I'll pose these to you, then you can help us try to make sense of them, because some of them are pretty complex. So this one in particular is one that's perplexing to a few people and hard to understand. Can I create a new lot code when I send product to my customer and not use the one generated by the farm? So this is a situation where I guess you would have multiple suppliers who then go into some sort of a distribution operation, or when products are being aggregated, repacked maybe in some way. Help us understand, when is it okay to create a new lot code when one was created by the producer or the farm or the first land-based receiver in the case of seafood? When is it okay to create a new lot code, and when is it okay, and when is it not okay to create a new lot code?
Yeah, and I think this is one that's going to, be where some of that complexity is when people are looking at their CTEs and saying, okay, and why it's important to really start to diagram out and map out your traceability process. The rule is pretty clear, I think, in terms of, these 3 bullet points are the conditions where a traceability lot code can be created. So it's when there's an initial packing of a raw agricultural commodity, when the first land-based receiving of food obtained from a fishing vessel. So obviously that's, seafood facing, and then a transformation of a food. So a transformation can be something like repacking, when you're repacking multiple lot codes or multiple different lot codes into a new single lot code. So that would be considered a transformation event. Or, if you're taking FTL ingredients and making a different food, or in the case of nut butters, when you're actually creating a nut butter. So that's a transformation event that under the proposed rule is called a creation event, but they simplified it all into this concept of transformation. So, there are very kind of clear set conditions when that can happen, but really kind of a lot of different examples that kind of test those rules. And I think that's where we're having a lot of conversations with the people that we're working with, is say, okay, well, is this a transformation event, or if I receive a bunch of different lot codes, and I maintain 90% of that in the supply chain, is that okay? Or is that considered creating a new traceability allowed code? So it's how are we maintaining kind of these many to one or many to many relationships, and what do I need to do to make sure that I'm going to be compliant with the rule? Because if the agency is going to focus on one thing in terms of the compliance, it's, in my opinion, going to be this: like, have you maintained the traceability allowed code in the supply chain as you're required to do? Because if you didn't, that's where we lose traceability, and that's, you know, kind of what stymies outbreak investigations. So, and then the second bullet talks about just ways to share information from a location standpoint. So, you know, in some instances, obviously, you know, in broker instances and things like that, you don't necessarily want somebody to know the physical location of the facility where product was coming from. So the rule allows for the use of this source reference ID as ways to basically not clearly describe the physical location of where product might be coming from in the supply chain as a way to maintain commercial confidential relationships. So that's what that bullet there speaks to.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Ben, because we get a lot of questions about that too. That the notion of the lot code generator source and what it represents and what's allowed within that and so forth. So this notion of maintaining some degree of, like you said, honoring proprietary relationships and creating some respecting confidentiality, while also at the same time creating a degree of transparency for the traceback is really critical. Okay, so we know that the U.S. food supply chain is an international supply chain, to be sure. So does this rule apply to products grown or produced outside the U.S.?
Yeah, I think this is a question that's come up, you know, for us more than once or twice.
All the time. Yep.
It does. So, you know, if it's an FTL food that's being imported into the U.S., then the rule does apply, as, you know, to all the other FSMA rules as well, for the most part. So, so in the case of traceability, the answer is yes. It really applies to those that physically hold the food, so importers or brokers. It doesn't necessarily apply to them, although a broker or importer could be designated as the entity to maintain those records. So if they sit in a point in the supply chain where, you know, tracking, receiving and shipping information is most efficiently done by a broker or importer, it's fine if they maintain those records. It's just the entity, or the language of the rule, the covered entity, then needs to make sure that if they've designated that to a broker and importer, that they're meeting the record keeping requirements, both in terms of properly identifying the CTEs and KDEs, and then also storing the records for the appropriate period of time, which is in most instances 2 years.
Good. Okay. So yeah, so the short answer is yes, right? If your product is from outside the U.S., if it's on the food traceability list, FSMA 204 does apply. So hopefully that simplifies things for some people. So this next one is, again, we're having lots of conversations about this, certainly at ReposiTrak and with our customers, and I know it's a big area of concern because, again, when the supply chain broadly considers implementing traceability under FSMA 204, one of the biggest considerations is the cost and operational complexity of creating key data element records at every critical tracking event, and particularly at distributors, or we'll just say generally, entities or locations that have lots of volume, and, you know, they're aggregating lots of different SKUs, and they're probably disaggregating and then reaggregating SKUs and cases. So what's the requirement at a distributor for case level information in the record when it comes to shipments to retail and restaurant customers?
Yeah, you know, and this, I'll give a little background in terms of just, you know, my previous investigatory and regulatory work. You know, when conducting traceback investigations, like through distribution was often where, you know, you lost lot level traceability. And so, you know, one of the reasons why I was a little, I'll just be honest, frankly surprised that the rule, you know, was passed and written the way that it was because, you know, it requires that lot code level traceability to go, throughout the supply chain for these FTL foods all the way down to restaurants and retailers. So, I think the important thing to point out here is that a shipping KDE, so if I'm a distributor and I'm shipping, I have to maintain and provide all the information that's listed in those bullet points. And that includes traceability lot code information for the food. I think, Derek, as you're mentioning the how you do that, because we can certainly envision ways where that would trigger a significant change to operations, or, it requires a different way to think about data management. You have to provide this information to FDA within 24 hours of request. I think it's important to note that that rule there doesn't say that the shipping KDE has to be created necessarily at the time of shipping. So, there's ways to think about that to be compliant with the rule, but also, not necessarily disrupt operations. And you can probably speak more to that within the context of data management.
Yeah, I'll just reference it very quickly. So again, this is a conversation we have a lot. So if you're on the call today, or you're listening to the recording, for those of you who will get it on a recording, if you work in a distribution center, or your organization runs distribution centers, you should talk to us about this, because there are ways to actually do this where, as Ben mentioned, you're in compliant with FSMA 204 because you have a KDE record, which clearly is at the case level, right? It's at the lot code case count level. And you can do that in the distribution centers without necessarily overhauling your operations, because most distribution centers don't collect the lot code information when you're creating your loads to ship to your retail restaurant customers. In fact, we haven't found anybody yet today that actually does that. So the majority of the supply chain today, as Ben mentioned, this is where investigation traceback breaks down, because it's an aggregation point, right, for many suppliers of many different types of products, and then it goes out to a lot of other locations. And so the vast majority of product that's consumed from grocery stores and restaurants comes to a warehouse or a distribution center, right? It doesn't go directly to the store. A lot does, but most of it goes through the warehouse. We can help you with that piece. So if that's a concern of yours, and you certainly need to be FSMA 204 compliant, but you want to minimize the impact on your operations, I would encourage you to give us a call. And you can, on the survey, again, at the end of the webinar today, on the survey, you can indicate if you'd like to have a follow-up with Ben and his team and talk more to TAG. You can indicate that if you'd like to talk to us. Again, no strings attached with us. You can talk to us, and we'll give you our best advice about what you might need to do from a data management standpoint. You can let us know on the survey. Okay, so then what if I don't have a system to generate the KDEs today? What should I do? I'm starting from zero.
Yeah, I think in this graphic, I think we shared on the last time we chatted about this a month or so ago. It's really put this up here just to show this was some modeling that was done by the federal government, just to look at sort of food flow in the supply chain back in 2018, 2019. Look at distribution hubs kind of within the country, but it's really meant to just show the complexity of distribution, right? So, obviously food coming from the Salinas Valley, gets distributed, a variety of different places throughout the US. And so, there's huge complexity within the supply chain. And that's really what this rule in some ways is trying to address. It's trying to systemize how do we kind of apply data in a way that makes it easier to trace back to where food actually came from, with a reasonable degree of speed and precision. A lot of people are collecting the information today that, are required by KDEs just by virtue of doing business. A lot of these data points already exist, but if you don't have a system in place today to really aggregate that in a way that's going to be 204 compliant, the first thing that I would say is think about creating your traceability plan, or starting to do that, because it's going to help you identify what are your critical tracking events and KDEs that you actually need to capture, and then kind of, pressure test that against reality, walk it through, much like you would do kind of a mock recall exercise, do a mock traceability exercise. Am I collecting the data in a way that allows me to provide it to a regulatory agency in 24 hours if I needed to, and I think there's a variety of different ways to achieve this. If you're small, fairly simple operation that can be done, on a spreadsheet and manually, most people will probably graduate beyond that pretty quickly, and then I think it's incumbent on people to look at, can my current data systems achieve this from a reporting standpoint, or do I need to think about, engaging and looking at other data systems as well? So there's not one answer, but if you're not doing it today, I would add it to your to-do list for June to start thinking about mapping this out and thinking about starting at least to develop your food traceability plan.
Yeah, it's great advice, because what we find in working again with all up and down the supply chain in our work with food companies is that it's easy to get a little bit myopic about your operation and your needs. And the thing to keep in mind with FSMA 204 is part of being compliant with FSMA 204 is you're going to have ability to share data. So if you're receiving shipments of food traceability list products, you have to have a way to get the data from the suppliers of those products. And if you're shipping downstream, you have to have a way of sharing the data, because the lot code and the lot code generator source have to move with the product as the product moves through the supply chain. It's handoffs, you're handing data off. And so most of the systems that you have the data. In most cases, you have the data somewhere, probably in a system, a warehouse management system, an ERP, but can you share it easily? And can you format it into a traceability record that can be easily retrieved in the event of an investigation and a call, because the FDA is going to call you and say, I need it in 24 hours in a sortable spreadsheet, right? So can you do that with the systems you have in place today? So what I tell people is, think about the needs of your customers. In many cases, a lot of companies have hundreds of customers, but every one of those customers has hundreds of suppliers, in some cases thousands of suppliers impacted by FSMA 204. So the need for uniformity, consistency, interoperability, and easy data sharing cannot be understated. It's the key to the whole success of the whole thing, right? So please keep that in mind. And again, if we can help you sort that out or even think about it in a different way, we're happy to do that. Okay, so I'm going to cue this up because this is something I think is really important. Ben's mentioned it a few times. The Acheson group, TAG, is the best in the world at this, right? So they are really a preeminent source of food safety advice and consultancy, public health, again, experts in traceability. We've arranged a special through ReposiTrak, partnering with TAG. You can work with TAG to get your traceability assessment for only $500. So it's crazy deeply discounted engagement with TAG, with Ben's team, to do a Zoom call and do an initial assessment and get a written report. Ben, you can talk more about it, but boy, I'll tell you, I would encourage all of you, this for some of you, this would be the best $500 you spend in your business this year. So please consider this. But Ben, what might they expect if they interact with your team for this?
Yeah, and I think, most people are coming to the conversation at least with some sense of, what my CTs and KDEs are, and if you're not, we can certainly help kind of map that out for you. I think where we're seeing need is, just in terms of, am I thinking about this right? Is this really, if I'm receiving a traceability lot code ID, can I change that? Or how are my data systems structured in a way that are going to be compliant with the rule? Or do I have to somehow change the way that I'm capturing that data? Or do I need to have conversations upstream, with the supplier to better understand how they're creating their traceability lot code? So, where I think we can bring value, hopefully, to folks is where they have some idea of what some of those more complex questions are. This is a new rule, new regulation. FDA did, I should mention, just put out a guidance document for their small entity compliance guidance. And if you Google that, you can find it pretty easily. Probably some of you already had a chance to look at that. I think it's a good document. I think it still probably doesn't go into the level of detail to the questions that we're getting, from the people that we're working with or the companies we're working with. So, again, I think much of this depends on looking at the context of a particular situation based on your experience, essentially based on your operations within the supply chain. So that's another way to think about using that kind of initial consultation, is if you've got, the 3 or 4 kind of burning questions that you have about am I thinking about this right from my CT and KDE standpoint? I think we can probably be helpful. So, or hopefully be helpful. I feel like we can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, for sure you would be. So now I'll just mention this. So again, if it's not apparent, if you're on this call, obviously you're engaged around FSMA 204, and you probably are trying to sort out what your requirements are and what you need to do. The thing to keep in mind, and I'll reinforce this, is there's a way to do it with your existing systems with no standardization of data required and no investment in new hardware or software required. There's a way to do it, and ReposiTrak can make it easy for you. But the key is you have to share data with your customers, and your customers have to have an easy way to get data from all their suppliers. So there's a data flow connection piece here that needs to happen. And for retailers and wholesalers, their considerations are not only getting the information from their primary suppliers into the warehouses, but they have to deal with it down to the stores and restaurants. Keep in mind, this impacts essentially every grocery store, every restaurant, most C-stores in the US. It's estimated to be 1.5 to 2 million facilities will need to have FSMA 204 record keeping in place by the enforcement deadline, which is only about 30 months away now. So clearly will be people in the supply chain that will not get there in time because they'll wait till the last minute to do it, and there won't be enough resources to help them do it. So don't be one of those companies. Get moving now. If we can help you understand this better, we're happy to answer any questions that you have. If you need help with a technology partner, obviously we'd love to talk to you about that. Reach out to us. Again, following the webinar, you'll get the survey. And again, I want to thank Ben. We probably have some questions here coming up, but I want to thank Ben for bringing his expertise and knowledge of FSMA 204 and traceability broadly to certainly our customers, our network of ReposiTrak companies, and everybody on the webinar today. I should remind everybody, you're going to get a recorded copy of this. So if you have questions now, I think maybe we had some questions submitted in the question pane. Is Mason wrangling the questions today?
Yep, and I do have a couple here for you.
Okay, great.
So you guys did talk about how traceability applies to the products that you don't physically hold, but there was a question pertaining to this subject, so I just wanted to make sure it was answered. The question was about when you maintain liability for the product, even though you don't physically hold it. So I just want to see if you guys could please talk a little bit more about that, and if there's a risk that data could possibly be duplicated as it's changing hands.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, right, even if you're not physically holding that product, are you essentially liable from a regulatory standpoint to accurately maintain it and pass it forward? If you've been designated, by the covered entity under the rule as the entity who's responsible for maintaining that. So if in writing or under contract, your customer said, I want you to maintain the traceability records for this, even though you're not going to physically hold it. If that's, laid out and you've delegated that authority as defined under the rule, then right, you would be the entity responsible for that, from a regulatory standpoint. So, well, at least from a contractual standpoint, the person who physically handles the food is still the one who's obligated under the regulatory standpoint. I should clarify that. I think, that speaks a little bit to, risk in terms of duplication of records and, data management and just sort of error overall. And I think that's probably, worth talking about, at least at a somewhat high level when we think about just compliance with this rule in general. FDA, the way the rule is written, there's not a provision that says the records have to be 90% accurate. There's an expectation of full accuracy. And at the same time, I think we recognize that these are still your human-driven systems, but I think that's where much like food safety documentation, there's an expectation of defining the process, defining what records are associated with that process, and then having a review and verification step as part of that process. Thinking about your traceability plan in the same way. So have I clearly defined the process? Have I defined how I'm going to capture those records? And do I have a review process or a kind of a QA check as part of that documentation? I think that can help address some of the situations, like the example that we talk about here in terms of duplication of records. So this again is going to be really kind of process-driven approach, I think, for people that are going to successfully comply with the regulation.
Great, thanks, Ben. Mason, next question.
Yep. Next one is, does this apply to food contact packaging materials?
There's a good one.
Yeah, so contact packaging materials are not currently on the food traceability list, the FTL list. So you can go to FDA's website, or we can, I don't know, well, might be a little late in the webinar to share it in the chat, but if you Google FTL food, FDA, it'll come up, you'll find that list, and I would recommend looking at it, the list that's on the FDA's website, but currently it does not. So, and again, that list is subject to change or be reviewed by the agency every 5 years. So if a food's dropped off of that list, then you can, then it's effectively immediately dropped off. If there's a food or if a food contact material were added to that list, there's a 2-year compliance period to add that in, and kind of basically to allow people to create these structures that would be needed to capture and pass that data through in the supply chain.
Great, thanks, Ben. And we did put the link to, I think Karen did it. Thank you, Karen. We did put the link to the FDA's website that Ben referenced in the chat. So if you can see the chat in your little control panel, you can open it up. You'll have the link there. If you feel like you can't get to what you need to on the FDA, I think the FDA did a really good job of preparing all the information that's on the website, and it's certainly been a resource for our team. But if you can't find something that's on the FDA's website, let us know, because maybe we've already found it and we can send you the link. But you'll find a lot on there. So, okay, any other questions, Mason?
Yeah, we have a couple more. This one's probably quick because it's similar to the last, but what are the requirements for a packaging distributor? There's someone that manufactures packaging that has food contact. Does this still require in-depth traceability, or can they possibly file an exemption?
You're off the hook.
Yeah.
You're off the hook.
You don't have to do anything. Yep. And
yeah. No packaging yet, gang. So packaging folks out there on the phone, you're off the hook. So maybe you take a few notes from Ben's advice today and take some steps to move closer to creating a traceability plan, or things just that are good. We always talk about what's required and what's right? So some things are required and some things are just the right thing to do for your business. So whether or not it impacts you, if you're an FSQA professional, you might want to start to pull some of these practices into your toolkit. Any more questions, Mason?
Yeah, looks like the last question here. How does the traceability plan need to be written out? Does it have to be like a flow diagram, a HACCP plan? And does a mock recall cover most of this if they already have those lot codes in place?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The rule doesn't specify any particular format. You just have to meet the requirements that were in the bullet points of that slide at the beginning of the presentation. The description of how you're capturing the information, how you've identified there we go. So the description of the procedures to maintain the required records, including the format and location, description of the procedures used to identify the foods on the FTL list that you manufacture, process, or hold, and then how you assign those traceability lot codes. So, it's very minimum. That's what it needs to describe. That said, how are you describing, basically the procedures that you're using to maintain the required records, and how are you describing where you're assigning those traceability lot code ID? I think one, way that Derek was talking about what's good or what's right. A good way to do that is to think about this as a process flow and be able to identify, here's all the steps that I went through to determine that this was the CTE that I need to maintain, and here are the associated KDEs, and then here's how those map over to my data system. So it is a written document that will summarize those activities, and I think the more descriptive it is, one, the more easy it is to update, if things change in the future, but two, the easier it is to tell, to regulators, here's how I identified this. So, and that's someplace, if there are more in-depth questions in terms of what that traceability plan could look like, I would say reach out. That's a conversation I'm happy to have.
Great. Well, Ben, thanks again. As always, we really appreciate the fact that you're bringing your expertise and that of the Acheson Group to help the industry move to FSMA 204 compliance. I'll say the same thing that I always do on these traceability webinars is get moving now, regardless of what approach you take. You should get moving now. Waiting is not a good strategy. There's a lot of work to be done throughout the supply chain. And if you're looking for partnership, there are opportunities for partnership, or whichever direction you go, just get moving now. Only 30 months. It's the law today, 30 months to full enforcement. A lot of work to be done in the supply chain. So don't wait, get moving now on your FSMA 204 journey. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you found it helpful. Again, there's a quick survey that'll be coming your way. Please fill it out. It's only a few questions. If we can help you or you want a follow-up call, you can answer on the survey that you'd like to talk to us. And we hope to see you again on a future traceability webinar. We have one every Tuesday, so watch your email if you need to receive the information on any future traceability webinars or any ReposiTrak webinars. You can let us know. Thanks, everybody. Good luck with FSMA 204 and everything in your business. Talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.